Blyland 10.2, June 8, 1723 AD. Night had fallen, and Hemhut was 4 minutes walking time away from Elizabeth Squire and her family. Gus Adams, his boys, and his posse were only 3 minutes' ride away. Elizabeth was frantically warning her father that Gus and his crew were coming, experiencing their approach through their own eyes. Her father, Caleb, who believed in his daughter's new gifts, nevertheless still found himself in disbelief at what she was telling him. He wanted it not to be true, and held that belief up until he saw them crest a nearby hill with their torches. "Father," Elizabeth cried, "they mean to set fire to our crops. They were even talking about burning down the estate." All but her 2 youngest sisters were outside with them, and all but Elizabeth and the 2 eldest broke out crying and moaning at Elizabeth's words. Gabriella made her best effort to quiet and console them, and led them inside at their father's instruction. That left only Victoria, the 2nd eldest daughter, Elizabeth, and the patriarch outside to confront them when the Adams posse rode up. They hooted and hollered as they rode up on horseback and surrounded the 3 of them. "Well, well, well," sneered Gus Adams as he dismounted and approached. Caleb put his arms out and motioned for his daughters to get behind him, placing himself between them and the mob. Gus spat a wad of tobacco out and walked with a conceited smile up to Caleb. "If it isn't the nigger lover himself," and without a further word he clubbed Caleb across the mouth as hard as he could and with all the hate he could muster, splitting his jawbone with the thick butt of his knife. Blood spewed from the poor man's mouth as he fell to his knees, and the girls screamed. Gus grabbed Elizabeth by the arm as she tried to run away. 2 of the older brothers snagged Victoria, also keeping her from retreating. Mrs. Adams was holding her Bible close to her chest and got real and true satisfaction from the violence she was witnessing. Given her way, she'd not only see the old man hanged, but his whole family as well. She was the biggest advocate for burning everything to cinders, for she was a righteous warrior for justice and did everything in the name of Jesus. Gus passed Elizabeth to 2 more of his sons, each of whom roughly took an arm. She was highly disoriented, the coming 4 seconds blending in with the passing 4, especially as she was being tossed around. Her father was in terrible pain, reconciling his forthcoming death in his mind, his jaw irreparably shattered from the blow he'd received, and he was losing a lot of blood. But Gus had come to oversee a hanging, and a hanging there would be. He wasn't fixing to let him bleed to death on him. "You know, Squire," he said, feeling very self-righteous, "I like you. From what I hear, you're a good man. I just can't let you keep going against the word of God by placing a group of niggers up on high. That's just not the sort of thing we tolerate here. It's ungodly, and if it's one thing we can't allow, it's blasphemy." There came stamps and hoots and many an amen from the posse, and Gus shook his head as if in disgust at Caleb Squire. Elizabeth suddenly cried out, "No!" She was responding to the words that were to come from his mouth next. "String him up," he said, and with that the all-too-happy mob fastened a rope around the kindly farm owner's neck, catching part of his severed jaw in the noose, adding to his pain. He was on the verge of losing consciousness. "Stop!" Elizabeth screamed as she struggled in the grasp of the 2 boys. "You can't!" Gus walked smugly over to stand in front of Elizabeth and said, "Well, you're a pretty young thing. At least you won't go hungry. Only you're probably going to have to do it a couple towns over. No one here is going to want nothing to do with a little nigger-loving whore." What was that? What was she seeing? In 4 seconds, when he's done speaking and revving up to spit in her face, something takes him. Elizabeth, suddenly calm and fixated on Gus, waited it out. She didn't flinch when Gus hawked up a throat full of foulness and leaned in to spit at her. She knew that the spit would not land, and there it came. A massive gray hand reached down from above, completely enveloping his head, then hoisted him off of the ground with ease. Hemhut had come up behind him. Before anyone had time to react, Hemhut had rolled Gus up into a little ball. Then, in seeming slow motion, he wrapped his other hand around the arms and chest of one of the 2 boys that were holding Elizabeth in place, the youngest Adams boy. The giant then picked him up like a toy. The boy's grip on Elizabeth jerked free, and then, quick as lightning, he shoved the boy's balled-up father down the poor boy's throat into his rib cage. When Gus's body recoiled and unfurled inside the boy's chest cavity, the youngest Adams boy practically exploded and was completely ripped in half. Hemhut looked Mrs. Adams dead in the eye for a brief fraction of a second, who was wide-eyed, horrified by what she'd just seen. Her husband of 33 years had been squashed and forced down the throat of her youngest son, who had then split apart right before her eyes. 3 more from the mob were dead before panic even had the chance to set in among the rest of them. All 17 of the men and boys who'd rode with Gus Adams were dead within a matter of seconds, smashed or torn apart by the giant. Victoria and Elizabeth watched in amazement. The giant's movements could scarcely be seen, they were so fast. And Elizabeth noticed something peculiar, something that would not seem peculiar to anyone besides her. The giant. She could not see through his eyes. Mrs. Adams was suddenly the last Adams standing, and the giant stopped to look at her. She held her Bible out in front of her in a trembling hand, showing it to the giant. "You go back to hell, you—" But she couldn't finish the sentence. Hemhut cut her off and said, "You could have stopped this." Then he kneeled down in front of her, seemingly awaiting a response. Her mouth opened wide and she took a deep breath, hate in her eyes, ready to spew out the poison in her thoughts. Then, before she said another word, with a flick of the wrist, he sent the hand with the Bible in it up toward her face, and the book lodged itself horizontally into her mouth, severing the ligaments and muscles of her jaw and ending up so far back into her head that it practically decapitated her. He turned his gaze to Elizabeth as Mrs. Adams collapsed, not dead, but left to weakly flail and struggle through vain attempts at removing the Adams family Bible from what remained of her head as she slowly drowned in her own blood. Her larynx had been completely obliterated by the intrusion of the Bible, so her attempts at screams made only popping, bubbling sounds. All the commotion had brought a large number of the farm hands and slaves from the quarters, who stood in witness of her 10th coming. Most of the squire girls were watching safely from inside through windows and cracks. Hemhut knelt in front of Elizabeth, who was unafraid. He touched her temples and said, "Hello, Lylin." And Elizabeth's squire was no more. Lylin stretched her little arms out to embrace the giant and said, "Hello, Hemhut." Victoria stood, mouth agape, and looked at her former sister, who looked the same but very different as well. What she was seeing from her sister was not the way Elizabeth carried herself or moved or held her facial expressions. Victoria immediately recognized that her sister was gone. Caleb Squire, in incredible pain and slowly bleeding to death, with his jaw in fragments, the noose still around his neck, wished to thank the giant, but could not operate his mouth any longer, and wasn't certain if he was hallucinating or maybe even already dead. The fallen and flung torches had started the plains ablaze, and the small patches of fire were growing larger by the second. Gabriella looked on from a cracked board inside the farmhouse. All but the 3 youngest daughters were watching alongside her. Hemhut surveyed the whispering crowd of people, and then looked down at Lylin in her newly acquired body. "All of them?" he asked. "I'm sorry," she said, releasing her embrace of him, "but he must not see you." "All of them, then." He nodded at her as if to let her know that he would happily do what was necessary, willfully or not. "Spare none that have looked upon you," she said, and with that he set about killing the rest of them. He put Caleb Squire out of his misery first, and then got straight to the workers and finally the sisters of Elizabeth Squire. Only the 3 youngest, the 2 that had slept through the whole ordeal, and the one who'd run and was hiding under the bed, survived. They had not seen him, and were therefore no threat. It was all over in a matter of a few minutes, and Hemhut hoisted her up to sit atop his shoulder, and he walked in the direction she pointed. They walked right past Mrs. Adams, still lingering on the verge of death. The last thing she ever saw was the 10-foot giant walking into a field on fire, and the girl that used to be Elizabeth Squire standing on top of the giant's head, balancing on one foot, arms out to her sides, the foot of her raised leg resting against the inner thigh of her erect leg like a ballerina, the highest flames nearly licking her toes. They cast an eerie silhouette as they receded into the fire. With Lylin holding both arms out straight by her sides to keep balance, the pair looked like the outline of a cross atop a mountain behind the wall of fire. As the silhouette faded, so did Mrs. Adams, having finally drowned in her righteous blood. May she burn in hell. "Did you hear him?" Lylin asked as they proceeded through the fire, having to speak over the crackle of flames. "Wasn't he wonderful?" A little jealous, Hamhut waited until they'd outpaced the fire and spoke softly as he said, "Yes, he was all that you said he would be." They traveled due east, heading for the Atlantic coast, and were soon surrounded by forest. Under the scattered tree-limb obscured moonlight, Hamhut asked, "Where are we going?" "We have to sink a ship, my love," she said, as she expertly climbed down from his head and found her perch on his right shoulder, knees drawn up with her arms wrapped around them. "Do you remember what I told you about the Dutch East India Company?" Hannah 2, December 22nd, 2009 AD. Hannah was now 30 and had never married. She'd had a few boyfriends here and there, but it was just her now. She and Brad the Bad had split up just 3 weeks ago after an 8-month relationship. It wasn't exactly mutual, and he had been pretty hateful to her when she couldn't offer justification for leaving him beyond that she felt that they just weren't meant to be together. She wasn't about to let it ruin her Christmas, though. She had lived in Las Vegas after moving there with her parents until she was grown, tried to leave twice, but wound up right back in Vegas where the money was easy to come by. She was a pretty girl among pretty girls and would cocktail waitress, serve food, any job with tips involved. It seemed that her looks, along with a little reserved flirtation, went a long way toward fattening her wallet when tips were called for. It was hotter than hot in the summer, like the nearby city she'd grown up in across the Arizona border. She'd had her heart set on moving somewhere cooler, somewhere that kids can play on the playground equipment in the summer without suffering third-degree burns, but she wound up back in Las Vegas. The winters were not so bad usually, certainly not anywhere near as severe as in parts of the rest of the country, and Hannah rather enjoyed the winter months in the desert. She had kept the 8-ball her parents' friend's kid had given her because he asked about it every time they visited for a number of years. Eventually, the boy matured and stopped asking for it, but it had always remained accessible on her shelf nevertheless. Hannah had lived with her parents until she was 23, then moved in pursuit of her dreams of being an artist to New York City. That lasted all of 6 months before she came back home. Her parents' friends were paying a visit as she had been packing her things for the New York move, and the little boy, then 10 years old, caught sight of the 8-ball. No 10-year-old boy alive would look at Hannah and not see a goddess, so he naturally tried his best to impress her with his adult-like vernacular, and took the ball from the shelf and in a rehearsed "I'm mature for 10" voice said, "Oh shit, I remember this." She stopped folding and packing clothes and approached him, pointing at the 8-ball. "You know, you scared the shit out of me with that thing when you were little," she said. "Really?" he said. "What happened?" He turned it over and shook it gently, then turned it back over and over again, toppling it in his hands. She came and sat next to him on the bed and told him the story of how he just kept repeating what sounded like "Hannah will die" and exclaiming yes those 7 years before. "Hannah will die?" he repeated. His hand stopped spinning it, and with the window facing up. Most of the time, the revelation of the 8-ball's response is pretty slow, given that the floating component had to part the dyed fluid in order to be seen, but sometimes a response would be revealed faster than other times, the rapidity of it governed by the same laws that typically make it slow under normal conditions. Hannah didn't think that it was funny, though, the quickness with which the words "it is certain" appeared in the window. She didn't find it the least bit humorous. Then he turned it over, shook it once more, and asked, "Will Hannah die?" "See," said the 10-year-old who'd so long ago given her the same 8-ball. "It doesn't say yes, it's just a toy." "Yeah," she said, staring at the purplish-white lettering. "It's just a toy." The response was different this time. "Ask again later." Only it had taken much longer to appear than it had the last time, only moments before when it had said, "It is certain." She had seen it, though. She would never forget it. It was certain. That was 7 years ago. After her failed stint in New York, she tried her luck in LA, which lasted almost twice as long, but ended badly as it usually did, with a breakup. She'd been back in Vegas for a little over 2 years now. With Brad the Bad out of the picture, she felt uplifted. He was a good guy, he just wasn't hers, nor was she his. She did not love him, not in the way she imagined herself loving the man she one day hoped she would love. Why postpone the inevitable she had contemplated prior to dumping him? She knew that she didn't want to marry him. It didn't feel right to string him along. She was stunning, having only become ever more beauteous with age, but it seemed to her that she was prized for her beauty and sex appeal over all else by nearly everyone, and that did not sit well with her conscience. She wanted to be desired for her intellect, her personality, her talents, but it seemed that the running joke from her teen years had carried over. That kid had been right after all. Most people she met were too busy looking at her ass to hear a word she said. Brad was certainly one of them, and she was done leading him on. She was ready to roll the dice again, to find someone who would love her, ass or no. When news of her having become single had spread amongst her co-workers at the casino, the pursuit of her began almost immediately. She had been asked out an average of 3 times a day over the past few weeks, and not just by customers. Her co-workers clamored for her from every corner, some from out of woodwork she never even knew existed. She had turned them all down, truthfully stating that she intended to stay single at least through Christmas to 1 in 7 of them, and flat out saying no thank you to the remaining 6 of 7. Tom, Andre, and Steve. She hadn't told them no as she had the others. She, in minced words, advised them that they were free to ask again after Christmas, but she truly didn't have a preference between them, a strong indicator that none of them were him. Her best friend Christy had come to visit bearing booze in a fatty and wearing a Santa hat. They had been working together the last year or so and had clicked right away when they met, becoming fast friends. She was also a cocktail waitress, gorgeous, but her beauty paled in comparison to Hannah's. One would be hard-pressed to find a beauty her equal, much less her better. They sat across from one another atop the rug on the living room floor of Hannah's apartment. She had gotten a new microwave and decided to use the box that it came in to fill with junk knickknacks, old clothes, and other wares to donate to the local thrift store. She was going through a reductionist phase and was slowly shedding off the layers of her confining material stores by finally getting rid of some of her stuff. She kept nice things, but did away with some fairly nice things as well, so she wasn't just giving away junk. As Hannah and Christy enjoyed the buzz of the booze, Christy inquired as to what was up with the box. Hannah set to rest her friend's sudden fear that she was moving and told her that it was just stuff that she intended to donate. Christy was relieved that her friend wasn't impulsively moving out of town, which for some reason was the first place her mind went when she saw the open box on the floor that was crammed with her friend's belongings. Hannah told Christy that she could go through the contents of the box if she'd like and keep anything she found that caught her fancy. So Christy dug in and set about making a pile of things she wanted to keep next to her on the floor. A scarf, a little stone statue of a kitten, and other such baubles. Christy paused from her scavenging and withdrew a pack of cigarettes from her pocket, from which she pulled out a neatly rolled joint. Then patted her pockets and said, "Shit, I didn't bring my purse up. I don't have a lighter." Hannah, not a habitual smoker, but never one to turn down the chance to smoke weed in a safe place with a friend, rose and said, "I know I have one somewhere," and pranced down the hall of her 1-bedroom apartment toward her room. She had an oversized headboard at the head of her bed, the type with all sorts of shelving and drawers. The sucker was heavy to move. As she swished the contents of the various drawers around, she came upon the old 8-ball she had gotten for her 16th birthday, the one that had twice delivered her a bad omen. She picked it up, remembering anew the tale of the 8-ball. Within a few moments more rummaging, the lighter that she knew was somewhere was found. She came back to her friend with the magic 8-ball in hand. "Uh-oh, what is that?" Christy teased. "I haven't seen one of those in years." Christy reached out for it, and Hannah waited before passing it to her. She wanted to tell her the story first. Christy lit the joint and listened as Hannah recounted the interaction she'd had with the boy and the 8-ball, and how it was certain. When Hannah had finished her reenactment, she then handed the ball to Christy, who accepted it with much less enthusiasm and was far less eager to play with it than she'd been a minute before. "That's crazy," Christy said, turning it over in her hands. "Okay, I'm going to try it." She paused and said, "Will Hannah die?" She turned the ball over, then upright again, and they both waited for a response. And waited, and waited. Some features seemed somewhat distinguishable through the purple liquid, but no matter how they angled or shook it, the reply simply would not appear in the viewing window of the toy. Maybe it's too old," said Hannah, more than a little relieved that no response appeared. "Well," Christy said, "let's ask it another question." Then of the 8-ball she asked, "Will I ever win $1 million?" She turned it over and back again. There was still nothing. The floating 20-sided die suspended in the fluid encased within the plastic toy must have taken on water. It was trying, but the best it could produce were vague purple-white lines. All that could be seen were the points of contact that required the least force to float to the window and displace the fluid, the edges of the die, the lines between the faces of the die. No reply was appearing despite their repeated attempts to manipulate the toy and reposition it. Nothing was there, until something was. Something must have happened. Something must have changed with the inner workings of the toy. The print finally started to become somewhat discernible. Maybe it just needed to be shaken up after all the years of rest, just moving from box to drawer to box and back. If they were patient enough, they could get answers. It seemed that all the movement had resurrected it, but with only a faint heartbeat. Both girls agreed that it was almost better this way, having to wait in anticipation of a response, then having to discern what it said through the dark fluid with little clarity. They went through all 3 of the guys that had asked her out recently with, should Hannah go out with Tom? Then Andre, then Steve. The predictions did not bode well for any of them, which made them both crack up laughing in their stoned and buzzed states. For Tom it said, "My sources say no." For Andre and Steve both, it read, "Outlook not so good." Hannah wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, having laughed so hard that she'd cried, and they settled down. "Oh, I have a good one," Christy said. 8-ball, is there even such a thing as a good man?" She turned it over and back, and they waited, watching it do its very slow work at a reply, and waited more. With both intently focused on the viewing window, Hannah told her friend, "By the way, you said it wrong." "What?" Christy looked up at her. "Said what wrong?" "Well, what he asked was, Hannah will die?" Hannah said, looking into the viewing window through where it was in Christy's hands. Still nothing yet. Christy didn't intend to ask the 8-ball anything. She was just repeating what her friend had said out loud, but it answered her anyway. When Christy repeated, "Hannah will die?" its response came almost straight away. Hannah turned white, even whiter than normal. Then when Christy looked down at the 8-ball and saw the words so clearly, it startled her so that she lurched and the toy flew out of her hands and up into the air. It came down hard on a pointed ear of the little bronze kitten statue in Christy's her pile, and at just such an angle to where a notch of plastic from the rim around the viewing window had splintered off, leaving a small triangular divot. "What the fuck?" Christy said. "Seriously, are you messing with me? This better not be a trick." She had gotten up and was pacing, circling around the 8-ball. Hannah looked up at her with tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's it." Christy picked up the 8-ball, dropped it into the box, picked up the box, carried it toward the door, opened the door, box in hand, looked at Hannah with her bloodshot, stoned eyes, and said, "Which way to the thrift store?" 3 days later, on Christmas morning, that same magic 8-ball, having been purchased from the thrift store for $1.50 by one Bill Jones, would serve as a Christmas gift to both his nephew and his niece. Because the 2 of them kept fighting over it, their mother had to take it away. Then when they kept finding it, she up and took it with her to work, and stuck it in her desk at the fire station, where it remained until the day it was passed on to a strange mute orphan 6 months later. Leland 10.3, January 19, 1724 AD. Commander Peter Vestrick had set sail from the Cape of Good Hope with his complement of 225, bound for Bavaria just the day before. It was the second cast-off on the maiden voyage of the vessel he commanded, commissioned to him by its investors from the Chamber of Amsterdam. She was called the Fortune. Since she had left port from the Netherlands nearly 4 months earlier, everything had gone well. Everything should go well. After all, they sailed in the service of the Dutch East India Company. That made them practically untouchable. The company had a monopoly on trade for many of the surrounding regions, which had earned them much loathing, but they also had an army and the authority to use force autonomously. Any nation or individual who would dare openly attack them would suffer the consequences, as would any that violated their impractical exclusive trade agreements. The company had become a monster in its own right, taking advantage of people at their most vulnerable, when they were desperate, starving, or otherwise suffering. To anyone who were caught in dealings with competitors of their trade, even when done out of desperation, they would show no mercy and often make very public examples of those responsible. They were a scourge on the world, a prime example of what can happen when a corporation wields more power than the state, and a keystone of Leland's design. The sky on the eastern horizon was turning from a dark purple to a dark blue. The mirage, the bent light of the sun, would be cresting on the horizon ridge inside a half hour, followed by Her Majesty the sun itself. It was freezing cold, and the hands manning the night watch grumbled as the winds began to pick up. Then, by the dim glow of the early morning, Hemhut took them. The giant rose from the depths beneath the Fortune and grabbed a hold of the ship from underneath. He attempted to quickly submerge and bring the ship down with him, but the hull gave way before he had it fully under water, and then it cracked in half, leaving him holding only the jagged piece of hull that had come off from the rest in his massive hands. The ship rebounded, rising rapidly, throwing the deckhands against the walls and masts, if not knocking them off the ship entirely. Some caught as much as 30 feet of air before crashing back down. The crew in their quarters had just as rough a go of it, having been violently tossed around in their bunks. Several of the crew were already dead or dying when Hemhut descended once more with the two halves of the ship in tow, one in each hand. The two halves had already taken on water, and this time they offered little resistance when Hemhut held them in place 100 feet down. He held the ship halves under until he no longer needed to, until they could no longer float, and they fell from his hands and sank to the ocean floor. A sailor that had found his way out of one of the halves was swimming frantically toward the surface. Hemhut followed him. He looked somewhat crocodilian in his movements, subtle body arcs seeming to propel him as though he were semi-buoyant. Just as the air-starved sailor who had escaped the wreckage was about to reach the surface and take a sweet breath of salty air, just as he let free the last breath in his lungs mere feet away from the fresh air, Hemhut gently grabbed him by the leg and kept him there, just under the surface, until he drowned. Then he tracked down the survivors, wading in the freezing water under the slowly brightening early morning sky, and one by one drowned them all. In the time they had spent waiting for the day to come, Hemhut had asked why the ship must be destroyed and its crew drowned. Leland had answered him truthfully and plainly that their deaths and so many more were instrumental in advancing the science needed to build her device, the machine that would end Daniel Dwyer. They had killed another 27 people throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia in the 7 months since she'd awakened, all hand-selected to die in order to manipulate various subtleties of the future, most centered on subjugating the demon. From her shoulder perch she had explained, "So much of the future will change as a result, it is hard to know where to begin. Most importantly, we must ensure that a scientist named Humphrey Davy will burn his eyes in an accident involving nitrogen trichloride in the early part of the next century, which will lead to him employing a man named Michael Faraday. Faraday will go on to create experiments that provide a link between the nature of light and the energy of magnetic fields, and will lay the groundwork for future scientists to harness the electromagnetic spectrum and unlock more of its secrets. He must become employed by Davy. because after becoming jealous of his early success in building the first electric motor using elements Davy himself discovered, Davy will put him to work for 4 years reverse engineering optical glass, and a glass block which Faraday will keep as a relic of his subjugation by Davy will prove vital to his proving the connection between light and magnetism. We must also ensure the timely transcription of his conclusions into mathematics by ensuring the birth of one James Clerk Maxwell, who does just that, opening the path for Faraday's experimental results to be integrated into theoretical mathematics and practical engineering. Without them, a man named Einstein, who will live 2 centuries from now, will be unable to dramatically further the understanding of existence in the way that I need him to. He is the next Isaac Newton, she continued. Without him, creation of my device is pushed back for thousands of years, well beyond the years I have remaining. His fate is critically intertwined with the future I envision. In fact, once the fortune is sunken, we must then await Italy to further ensure his survival. There will be an earthquake in Sicily at the end of the year after next. It is there where I must die, after you have been saved away. Why must you die there? The giant asked. The descendant of a person who escapes near death during the earthquake will murder Einstein and other members of his family shortly after they move to northern Italy in 1895 in a robbery attempt. I have to prevent her from surviving the earthquake. If you go in my stead, he will see you, and he will know you, and he will come too early. We will have the time in between to spend together. Either by way of a miracle, if not by some stroke of dumb luck, we managed to evade the demon's gaze for another 2 years, almost 3 this time, my love. I wish that I could tell you that we could spend this time with one another in peace, but we have many more tasks ahead of us. I am sorry. She climbed down to be cradled in his arms and closed her eyes to rest. But all of my next life, as promised, is yours. I will then live for 3 years and 1 week, and they will be all happy days spent together, just us two, my dear Hemhut. I have asked so much of you, but we will at least for a time know peace thanks to you. I just need to ensure that the tools we will need to subdue Daniel Dwyer will be constructed when the time comes, and of course that he be born when he need be, and I be born when I must. She yawned and curled up in the bed of arms. The giant was warm for her. How about that Isaac Newton, though? Wasn't he wonderful? He was the last of our people to do anything worthwhile, and I don't think I could have done any more without him. It's too bad about his obsession with alchemy and his fruitless search for coded messages written into biblical text. Faraday and so many other men of reason will also be highly religious, even Einstein himself. It pains me to think of what accomplishments the world will go without due to so many scientists having wasted so much of their time in pursuit of such folly, trying to reconcile their outlandish faith with what they know to be reality. Still, he was amazing, wasn't he? Again, the jealous giant said, all that you said and more. Thus proceeded the trial of the 10th iteration of Lyelin. The population of Earth had grown so large that it concealed them well from the demon, and she foresaw that she could live out her 10th life for over 3 years without fear, but it was not a life spent in peace with her love. It was a life once more lived in pursuit of defeating Daniel Dwyer. They would leave another 116 bodies on their trail throughout civilization before parting on the outskirts of Palermo nearly 3 years later, where Lyelin had tearfully bid him walk away. In their travels, Hemha had asked her what more happens as a consequence to the changes they'd made this time, and she'd told him. Things of great consequence, my love. There will be 2 great world wars, and the advent of powerful atomic weapons will bring great destructive power into their possession much earlier, which they will then use against each other. The progression of medicine and hygiene will cause the population to begin swelling, eventually to unsustainable numbers. The fruits of their engineering will poison the water and the air. Many will die who might have otherwise lived, and many will live who might have otherwise died. Many who would have been will never be, and many who never would have been will be. By making the changes we have made, we will have paved their way to so many great achievements. but the fruit of the majority of those labors will be fashioned into weapons before the end, weapons they will use to slaughter one another. We give to them dreams, Hemhut, dreams they then twist into nightmares. They are all but beyond redemption, only a means to an end now. But do not worry. All will be as it should. We can still make things right. Hemhut had to suffer the sound of her death from a distance, as he had been made to do so many times before, only once ever having been permitted to be with her as she passed, and only because he was miserably the instrument of her death in that unspeakable instance. He rarely showed emotion, but every time that she died, he became a little more downtrodden and all the more infuriated with this Daniel Dwyer, this demon. Lylin had been spinning tales of the dark spirit and their inevitable confrontation since before he could remember. Perhaps with fervor beyond the breadth of even Lylin herself, Hemhut hated Daniel Dwyer. It would be nearly 3 centuries until he would be born. He had never heard his voice, nor seen his face, but Hemhut despised Daniel Dwyer with a passion unrivaled. That hatred lowered ever deeper, became ever stronger as he listened to the last breath escape her mutilated body as she was crushed by a collapsing ceiling. Her last words, just before she died, screaming child scratching at her arms and hands in a vain struggle to escape her clutches, spoken softly and directed at him over the wind, were, "Until next we meet, farewell, my love." Then Lylin was again gone, and Hemhut was alone.